On the day Aunt Megan passed away, I, not knowing anything yet, lay up to my elbows in the garden soil, with that quiet, almost meditative concentration with which you can only take care of something as alive and fragile as young shoots of roses, carefully planting them in loose soil. Exactly those bushes what she gave me for my birthday just a couple of weeks ago, accompanying the gift with her trademark soft smile, which always hid something more than could be caught at first glance. And before we continue, write in the comments from which city you are watching this video. Enjoy watching. My phone, which I had shoved into my jeans pocket, still wouldn't stop, ringing insistently and ruthlessly, as if it knew it was time to break my lull. I tried to ignore him, focusing on the roots, the shape of the bush, and the softness of the ground, but at some point I gave up, sighed, took off my dirty gardening gloves, and, wiping my forehead with my shirt sleeve, finally pressed the answer button. "Miss Williams," came an unfamiliar male voice, smooth, collected, with that cold politeness that immediately makes you tense up. "This is Daniel Taylor, your Aunt Megan's lawyer. I'm afraid I have some unpleasant news for you." My heart skipped a beat, as if it had stumbled, and suddenly those roses in my palms, delicate, fragrant, with velvety petals, began to feel unbearably heavy, as if they reminded me of something I felt but didn't want to admit. These flowers were the last gift from her, and in some strange, deep way, I already knew that. "What happened?" I whispered, barely breathing, trying to keep my voice as low as possible, as if the volume of my words would determine if something terrible would actually happen. "Your aunt passed away peacefully in her sleep last night," he said softly and carefully, with the kind of attention one pays to relatives at the moment of loss. He paused, heavy, thick, like the silence before a storm. "She gave me clear instructions to contact you first, before contacting anyone else in the family," he continued, and in these words, oddly enough, there was a warm note as if even from beyond this world, Aunt Megan was still trying to hug me, take care of how I've always done it. My knees buckled, and without thinking, I slowly sank to the wet ground, not noticing how the cold moisture penetrated through the fabric, hearing almost nothing but my own breathing and ringing in my ears. Memories flashed before my eyes. Aunt Megan, the woman who patiently taught me to read, putting letters into words when I still couldn't concentrate for more than a minute, who quietly hid warm chocolate cookies in my palm when adults discussed boring and too loud topics at a family dinner, who always, without a single word of condemnation, supported my dreams, even the most reckless, just nodding and looking as if she knew I would succeed. And now she's gone. Forever. "Miss Williams, are you there?" Taylor's voice brought me back to reality. "Yes," I managed, feeling a knot tighten in my throat. "I'm here. What do I need to do?" He cleared his throat, as if it wasn't any easier for him than it was for me. "Your aunt left very detailed instructions on how to organize her funeral," he said, and paused again, as if trying to find the right words. "She also left a letter especially for you. It should be read before the funeral. Could you come to my office today?" I looked down at the roses in my lap, their delicate petals reflecting the pale light of the morning sun. It was the Queen Elizabeth variety, Aunt Megan's absolute favorite, a variety she spoke of with awe, almost with love, and which she herself handed to me just 3 weeks ago, her eyes sparkling with that playful, slightly mysterious sparkle that I always adored in her. "These roses have been in our family for generations," she said then, holding out a pot of flowers and smiling her special, understanding smile. "Like all the best family secrets." I just laughed at the time, thinking it was one of her weird, charming comments that she'd throw around. But now, sitting with those roses on my lap, I wasn't so sure. What if it really was part of something bigger? "I'll be there within the hour." "I promise," I said, getting up from the ground, feeling the damp cloth stick to my skin, and went to change clothes and get ready. Daniel Taylor's office looked exactly as I had imagined when he introduced himself as a lawyer managing the affairs of wealthy clients. Polished dark wood furniture, shelves lined with heavy leather, bound volumes, and behind the huge window was a panorama of the city, the very view for which people pay more than I earn for the year. When I entered, he stood up and held out his hand to me, and his smile was genuinely sympathetic, but without being overly sentimental. "Miss Williams, thank you for coming so quickly. Please have a seat," he said, pointing to one of the deep chairs at the table. I sat down awkwardly, feeling as if I had entered a different world, a stranger in a room where everything smelled of formality and mystery. "Mr. Taylor," I began, looking directly at him, "what's all this about? Why did Aunt Megan insist that you contact me first?" Without saying a word, he opened his desk drawer and took out 2 envelopes. One is thick, official, with an official stamp and clear corners. The second one is modest, cream, colored, and it has my name on it, written in Aunt Megan's handwriting, elegant, confident, a little old-fashioned, which I would recognize among 1,000. "Your aunt was certainly a unique woman," Taylor began, choosing his words with an almost visible effort. "Brilliant in business, meticulous in detail, she had a firm opinion on how her last wishes should be fulfilled. She left clear instructions regarding her will and funeral arrangements." "It definitely looks like Aunt Megan," I whispered, and I couldn't help but smile, though painfully, the way you smile when you remember someone you loved more than you realized. He carefully slid a cream-colored envelope across the polished table toward me, as if he were handing me not just a letter, but the key to a long-locked door that held treasures or perhaps ghosts of the past. "She asked you to read this letter in person first," he said softly, nodding slightly. "Once you're done, we can discuss the rest." My fingers, which had been trembling slightly with excitement, hesitantly reached for the envelope, and when I touched the thick paper, I caught a faint scent, a familiar, enveloping mixture of roses and vanilla, the same one that Aunt Megan always smelled of, and which now seemed almost unreal, as if she were still there. She whispered something across the border between worlds. I slowly opened the envelope, trying not to damage it, as if the gesture itself was meant to be filled with reverence, and pulled out a single sheet Aunt Megan's personalized paper with elegant embossing and a neat indentation in the corner. "My dear Elizabeth," the letter began, and those first words, written in her handwriting, hit me harder than I expected. I held my breath, feeling something inside me freeze, as if time had stopped for a moment. "If you're reading this, it means I've finally run out of time. Please don't get upset. I lived exactly the life I wanted. Few people can rightfully claim this." The words flowed smoothly, calmly, as if she was talking to me across a distance that could no longer be measured in miles or days. "But I need one last favor from you, my beloved niece. You have to read another letter aloud at my funeral. A letter that will change our family forever. It's hidden in a secret compartment of my jewelry box. Do you remember how to open it? I showed you this carved rose trick when you were just 12 years old. I remembered that day, summer, the scent of jasmine, the light filtering through the curtains, and Aunt Megan leaning over me with a box in her hands, telling me with a conspiratorial smile how to turn a pedal so that an invisible compartment opens. I thought it was just a game. Now it was a cipher, the key to the mystery. Some may call this letter revenge, but I prefer to see it as justice. Belatedly, perhaps, but still fair. You deserve the truth, and so do I. Everything I own is Huntington Industries, my personal assets, and it's all yours now. Be brave, Elizabeth." My breathing hitched, and for a second it seemed as if the room had suddenly shrunk around me. The furniture had become more angular, the air heavier, the light dimmer. Aunt Megan's last request weighed heavily on me, as if she had placed on my shoulders not only the key to the family secret, but also the burden of years of silence. Her secrets, always surrounded by half hints, sarcastic smiles and a look from under her eyelashes, now demanded to be voiced, out loud, in front of everyone, in front of the very people who had spent their whole lives building appearances and pretending. "But there is one important condition," the letter continued. "You should read this letter aloud at my funeral, in front of the whole family, without exception. I understand that it takes a lot from you, especially at such a difficult time. But Elizabeth, you've always been strong, honest, and brave. That's exactly why it has to be you. With all my love, Aunt Megan. P.S. Under no circumstances should you let them bury me in something beige. You know perfectly well how I feel about beige." I couldn't help but smile through my tears. Of course, she hadn't forgotten about that either. Beige is her sworn enemy, the color of compromise, despondency, and boredom, as she once put it, looking at someone's outfit at a family wedding. Even in death, she remained herself, unique, categorical, and completely real. I read the letter twice, every line of which was now burning in my memory, and then slowly raised my eyes and looked at Taylor, who was waiting patiently, giving me space and time. She left everything to me? I said, feeling my voice tremble treacherously, almost unable to believe what I had heard. He nodded, his expression serious but not dramatic. Then, following the procedure, he opened the official envelope, removing the papers. Huntington Industries, its personal assets, investment portfolios, total assets. All this amounts to about $115 million, he said clearly, as if every syllable had been rehearsed in advance. However, as she stated, this inheritance depends on whether you fulfill her last request. I felt dizzy. The figure wasn't just stunning, it was so far from my reality that for a moment it seemed unreal, like the numbers on a lottery ticket. Aunt Megan has always been generous with me, with books, advice, time, money for tuition, but this. It was beyond what I could have imagined. What about the rest of the family? I asked, gathering my strength, trying not to sound either reproachful or too confused. Taylor nodded again, tilting his head slightly to one side. There are a few small wills for them, but most of the estate will go to you if you comply with its terms. I felt my thoughts whirl. My father, always jealous of his younger sister's success, restrained, critical, hiding his resentment behind feigned indifference. Cousins, who for years surrounded my aunt with attention, flattered her, invited her to dinners, showered her with compliments, as if they were playing a long game that they had now lost. I remembered all those endless family gatherings where Aunt Megan invariably took a seat by the window or in the corner. She seemed to keep in the shadows, but in fact, it was she who controlled the light. She was watching. She waited. And now that she was gone, her moment of truth had arrived. I finally asked, and my voice sounded quieter than I expected. In 5 days, Taylor replied quickly, checking his papers. Your aunt was precise in every detail. The service will take place at St. Patrick's Cathedral, followed by a reception at her estate. The whole family is expected to be present. I stood up, clutching Megan's letter tightly, and felt the tremor that a moment ago had manifested itself only in my fingertips, now rolling through my entire body, like a wave rising from the depths of a long-forgotten sea of memory. The letter pulsed in my hand like a living thing, like a heart that still continues to beat, despite the fact that its owner has already left. Then I had to go. I didn't have time to think, to doubt, just to move forward, to the box, to the next step in this carefully constructed ritual that I inherited. As I approached the door, Taylor, who had previously seemed distant and almost speechless, suddenly called out to me in a low but insistent voice. Miss Williams, one more thing, he said, his voice taking on a shade of the same seriousness that sounded in the letter. I stopped, turned around, and then he continued, Your aunt specifically wanted me to deliver another message. She said, Elizabeth, you know exactly what to do with the truth. I didn't answer. I just nodded, because at that moment no words could convey all that was whirling inside me: fear, pride, pain, determination, and most importantly, the feeling that my whole life was finally coming to its destination. The drive to Megan's estate, which always seemed to me to be something unchanging, as if frozen in time, seemed endless, although according to the navigator it took no more than 30 minutes. But on the road, every moment stretched out, as if space itself was resisting facing the inevitable. My mind worked feverishly, sketching and rejecting assumptions, formulating questions that had no answers. What was written in the second letter? What family secret was hidden under the gloss of all these years, under the smiles and the photos, under formal congratulations and feigned intimacy? What could Aunt Megan be hiding that she decided to give everything to me only in exchange for public exposure? As I approached the gate, it swung open automatically, as if knowing who I was, as if the earth itself had succumbed to my determination. The code that Megan handed me once, explaining it in a simple way, I trust you more than these pieces of hardware, now seemed like a holy password, opening not just the estate, but the vault of her soul. The mansion, Victorian, majestic, but not intimidating, stood exactly the same as in my memories, surrounded by gardens, where roses wrapped around every corner, reminding of the tenderness that hides thorns. Mrs. Evans, the devoted housekeeper, met me on the porch. Her eyes were red and her eyelids were swollen, the marks of a night spent crying. "Oh, Miss Elizabeth, thank God you're here," she whispered, taking my hand. Your aunt has left instructions allowing you full access to her private rooms. I squeezed her hand lightly, trying to convey warmth and gratitude. Thank you, Mrs. Evans. I won't stay long, I replied, knowing that her words were not just polite, but something more, a desire for someone close to my aunt to see her off with understanding and dignity. Megan's bedroom was on the second floor, and as soon as I entered, the feeling of her presence flooded into me. The windows overlooked the rose garden, which she loved so much. Now the branches seemed sad, bent to the ground, as if the plants themselves were grieving. The room was both refined and homely: silk curtains, vibrant hues, paintings in which Art Nouveau juxtaposed with portraits of ancestors, hints at a long line of women like her, strong, unusual, dangerously honest. The jewelry box was in its place, as if it was waiting for me. Its surface was carved with such skill that it seemed as if the tree was singing under your fingers, and the floral patterns were pulsating with their own life. I bent down and ran my fingers over the carving until I found the same pattern, a small rose, the third petal from the left. The third petal on the left, I whispered, almost soundlessly, remembering how my aunt taught me this as a child, how we laughed, as if sharing a magical secret. With a muffled click, the panel gently slid aside, and a secret compartment opened in front of me. There, neatly folded, was a second envelope. It was sealed with dark red wax, and on its front, in a clear, slightly slanted handwriting, it read, "It should be opened at my funeral." I picked it up and felt an unexpected weight. It was denser than I expected, as if it contained not only the letter, but also the weight of the years that had passed while this truth was maturing. My hand was shaking as I picked up the envelope. The temptation to open it right now was almost irresistible. It seemed to me that if I didn't find out the truth right now, I would go crazy. But I knew Megan. I knew how she thought through every detail, how carefully she weighed the moments. If she insisted on public reading, then that was the only strength of her intention. I took a deep breath and put the envelope in my bag, saving it for the day when everything would change. When I looked back one last time, I noticed a photo on the bedside table that I hadn't seen before. Young Megan, barely 20 years old, stood in front of the building, the original office of Huntington Industries. She had the same smile on her face that I knew, smart, insightful, a little cheeky. Looking at her, I felt as if she was looking at me through time and saying, "You know what to do. What secret have you been keeping all these years?" I whispered, looking at her image. What truth can be so important that you are willing to wait your whole life to reveal it? The next 5 days passed by like a whirlwind, each of them tinged with the hues of fuss, sorrow, hidden politeness, and annoying tension that always accompanies preparations for such tragic events. Phones were constantly ringing in the house, doors were slamming, and the walls seemed to absorb every voice, every whispered word, every understatement. Behind all these preparations, ordering flowers, coordinating the arrival of distant relatives, clarifying the last details of the ceremony, I stood as if detached, as if watching a play where I was assigned the main but invisible role. My father called me almost every day, at first, it seemed, out of sincere concern, asking how I was feeling, if I needed help, if I was doing well, but soon there were notes in his voice that I knew all too well: alertness, anxiety, an attempt to figure out if I didn't know. I am something more than others say. He couldn't ask directly, but each of his "how are things going with the will?" sounded like a veiled, "What did Megan leave you? Why are you and not me?" My cousins, Scott and Amanda, didn't bother with diplomacy. They wrote me long, ornate messages pretending to be interested in my well-being, but there was greed between the lines, clumsily disguised as concern. You didn't expect it either, did you? I wonder why exactly you were so close to Megan? Asked Amanda. I hope you understand that family matters need to be discussed together, Scott instructed. I didn't answer. Not to them, not to my father, not to myself. Because in my hands, in the hidden pocket of my bag, all this time there was a sealed envelope. Its weight was much more than just paper and wax. It was the weight of time, truth, fate. At night, when everything was quiet, when the city stood still outside the windows and only the wind rustled the leaves, I sat by the window, took out an envelope and slowly rolled it in my palms, as if trying to guess what kind of words were hidden under this thick, antique parchment. What photos could Megan have put there? What memories did she consider so important that they were about to become the property of the whole family? What truth was so great, so dangerous, or perhaps so painful that Megan decided to entrust it to the world only after death? The morning of the funeral turned out to be surprisingly bright, clear, and spring-like, as if the sky itself wanted to see Megan off with honors devoid of darkness. I stood in front of the wardrobe for a long time, sorting through the outfits, until I settled on a dark blue suit, her favorite color, in which she said I looked serious, but not harsh. I pinned one of her roses to my lapel, which was kept dried in a special box, and only then did I feel ready. The envelope was with me. He hadn't left me for a second since the day I found him in the box, and now he seemed to have become a part of my body. By the time I arrived, St. Patrick's Cathedral was already full. Everything inside resembled a frame from an old movie about a family whose roots go back to the distant past. The Huntingtons were known not only for their wealth, but also for their influence, and Megan was, and always will be, their living symbol. Among those gathered were business partners, officials, patrons, neighbors, journalists, distant relatives, all those who knew Megan in her various forms, as a leader, as a mentor, as a generous patroness of the arts and sciences. I had just entered when my father came up to me with an expression in which anxiety and irritation were simultaneously fighting. "Elizabeth, we need to talk about the will," he whispered, looking around as if someone might have overheard him. "Taylor doesn't say anything. He keeps saying that we'll find out everything only after the ceremony. But you know something, don't you?" I looked him straight in the eye, and for the first time in my life I felt that something insurmountable had appeared between us, like an invisible wall. "We'll find out everything together, Dad," I replied calmly. That's exactly what Aunt Megan wanted. He tried to grab my arm and hold me back, but I already knew I had to keep going. "Elizabeth, if you," he began, but I gently pulled away. "Let go, Dad. It's Megan's funeral. Let's show some respect." The ceremony was, without exaggeration, magnificent. Everything from the organ music to the priest's speech was impeccable. Not a single beige element, as Megan requested. Instead of dull neutrality, there was a riot of colors in which she lived: deep red roses, bright pink buds, garlands of fresh flowers that decorated every corner. In his speech, the minister noted not only her generosity and intelligence, but also a rare quality: the ability to change other people's lives just by being around. And so, when the last words of the service died away under the arches of the cathedral, Taylor, who was sitting in the first pew, caught my eye. He nodded almost imperceptibly, and there was everything in that movement: recognition, trust, a sign. My heart was racing as I stood up. The envelope, which now felt as heavy as a stone, was in my hand. I felt the attention of hundreds of eyes turn to me, as the air in the cathedral became thicker, denser. My father tensed, leaning forward, his gaze riveted on my hand. Nearby, Scott and Amanda froze like vultures, catching a whiff of the near truth. I took a deep breath, trying not to tremble. The smell of roses reminded me of her garden, of that photograph, of how she looked through time. And then I started talking. "Before my death," I began, and to my surprise, my voice sounded clear and even, despite the storm raging inside. I looked at Scott, and despite his worried face, in which fear and confusion were fighting, I saw in his eyes the same thirst for truth that had lived in me all these years, invisibly but inexorably. My voice was calm. I didn't shout, I didn't justify myself, I didn't convince. I just continued to read Aunt Megan's letter, as she wanted, as she asked, as she commanded. "Because the truth matters," was my reply. "Because silence is complicity. Because even decades after Kevin's death, I could hear his voice in my memory every night. Because being honest with yourself is the only way to truly live." I saw people whispering among themselves in the depths of the cathedral, some shaking their heads in horror, others nodding, as if there was a response in their hearts to these words, perhaps long expected. George acted alone. I continued to read the letter. He was full of envy. He couldn't stand that he wasn't the one who built the empire. And when the opportunity presented itself to appropriate everything for himself, he took advantage of it. I found a fake signature, an order to change the braking system, associated with a certain mechanic, whose name later disappeared from all archives. I found evidence of meetings that shouldn't have happened. It took me a while to put it all together, but year after year, step by step, I reconstructed the chain of events, stubbornly, like an archaeologist, unearthing not only the company's past, but also my own soul. A silence hung in the air, ringing and painful. I heard someone sob, maybe Amanda, maybe one of the older women in the family, who still remembered the days when Megan and George were inseparable. The father stood as if thunderstruck, clutching his gloves in his fists, and there was something elusive in his eyes, perhaps remorse, perhaps anger, perhaps just fright at the fact that everything his life was built on was crumbling right in front of his eyes. You may ask, why have I been silent for so many years? The letter continued. Because my family was holding me back. Because I loved George like a brother, no matter what. Because I was afraid that the truth would destroy us all. But now that I have nothing to lose, I want everyone to know that Huntington Industries was built not on trust, not on honesty, but on betrayal. And I don't want this lie to live longer than me. I folded the letter and carefully placed it on the lectern, and then took out the remaining documents from the envelope, certified copies of contracts, financial records, scans of the original drawings, old photographs of Kevin drawing the company's logo on a chalkboard, in the very basement where it all began. She kept everything, I said, addressing not so much the audience as Megan herself, down to the last line, down to the last signature. Because I knew that the day would come when the truth would be heard. A voice came from the back rows, low and broken by time. She did the right thing. I didn't find out who said it, and it probably didn't matter. The main thing is that the words were spoken. For the first time, someone in this family recognized that the truth has a right to exist, even if it hurts. Especially if it causes pain. I'm not reading this letter for the sake of scandal, I added. I'm reading it because my aunt entrusted me with this mission. She knew I could handle it. That I have the courage to stand here among you and say something that you may never have wanted to hear. Scott lowered his head, Amanda turned away, and his father, without saying a word, sat down, his shoulders slumped, as if the weight of these decades had fallen on them. More than 60 years have passed since Kevin's death, I concluded, and all this time the truth has been waiting. And now it has sounded. Not to destroy, but to liberate. Not to condemn, but to remind that at the heart of any business, any name, any family should be something more than ambitions. There must be a conscience. Thank you. I took a step back, my voice still ringing in the silence, my chest heaving with emotion, but my hands were no longer shaking. I kept my promise. I gave a voice to someone who was deprived of a future. I gave Megan the voice. Returning to Megan's letter, I continued reading, as if I were returning to those days when everything was just beginning, when dreams were born in the silence of laboratories and construction sites, when every step, every drawing, every idea mattered. I'm talking about this now because for 60 years I've been turning Huntington Industries into a company that Kevin would be proud of, I began, feeling my inner excitement give way to a clear, deep confidence in the correctness of Megan's words. I've made sure, she continued, that our success funds research, supports innovation and sustainability, and creates opportunities for brilliant minds like him. I knew that these words were not just an excuse, but an oath lived in action. Every project, every grant, and every new technology implemented under her leadership were steps in this moral redemption, hard and honest. But despite all this, Megan confessed, over the same 60 years, I've watched my brother capitalize on his crime by raising his family in the belief that privilege and power free them from justice. And when I read these lines, it seemed to me that the cathedral had become even quieter, if that was possible. I glanced at my father. He was no longer standing straight, as at the beginning of the ceremony. His shoulders sagged, his gaze was lowered, and something appeared in his appearance that I had never seen in him before. Weakness, confusion, almost fright. He no longer argued or objected, as if he understood that with each line he was losing not only control, but also everything that seemed to him unshakable. The truth should have come out many years ago, I continued to read in a voice that now sounded like Megan herself. However, by the time I had gathered enough evidence, Huntington Industries had grown significantly, providing jobs to thousands of people whose livelihood depended on its survival. And in those words, the full weight of the choice she faced sounded, to tell, and perhaps destroy the lives of innocent people, or to remain silent, and preserve the structure built on lies. The premature exposure of George's crime could devastate innocent families. The words were whispered, and I knew that each of the women sitting in this cathedral could understand that the choice between the truth and protecting others is rarely easy. That's why I made a difficult decision. I waited, patiently building and strengthening the company so that when the truth was revealed, Huntington Industries could weather the storm. I took a deep breath and took out the last document, a yellowed, faded envelope with uneven, shaky handwriting addressed to Kevin Davis's daughter, Emily. It was the letter to which Megan led the entire narrative, as to the climax, to the moment in which everything's secret became clear. And that brings me to my last confession, I continued. All these years, I have been silently supporting Kevin's only surviving child, Emily Davis. I anonymously funded her education, supported her pioneering research in sustainable engineering, and watched her grow into an outstanding, ethical scientist, just like her father. And here, among the ancient walls filled with expectation and awe, a rustle swept through the hall. Surprised, stunned voices at once stirred up the space when one woman slowly rose from her seat, her face pale with excitement, her eyes deep, thoughtful, with the same firm determination that once shone in her eyes. Kevin. It was her, Emily. Megan has everything covered. She knew that on this very day, at this very hour, Emily should be here, not as a spectator, but as a witness, as an heiress, as a link in a chain broken by betrayal, but restored by the truth. I took a deep breath and continued reading, feeling as with each word my voice was filled with a power that was not mine, but which I had become a guide to. The second part of my agreement leaves 41% of Huntington Industries shares to Emily Davis as partial compensation for what was unfairly taken from her father, and as I said this, I saw Emily press her hands to her chest, her lips trembling, but she stood there, straight, silent, noble. However, my niece Elizabeth owns a controlling stake in the company, and here I almost flinched. Saying my name out loud in this letter sounded like a blessing, like a trust, like a testament. To the only member of the Huntington family, Megan wrote, who consistently demonstrates the ethics, honesty, and vision that Kevin and I once shared. I looked up. There was such silence in the cathedral that you could hear a drop of wax falling from a candle. The people didn't move. It was not just a pause, it was the silence of comprehension, digestion, and deep rethinking of the entire history of the family, company, and destinies. I finished reading the last line of the letter, and it resonated like a final chord in the hearts of everyone present. Signed, Megan Huntington, co-founder of Huntington Industries and keeper of its greatest shame. And timelessness set in. I do not know how long this silence lasted. No one said a word or moved until Emily Davis finally stood up and walked down the aisle with a firm step, never taking her eyes off the man to whom, as it turned out, she owed years of silence. My father. He sat hunched over, as if every scar from the past had appeared on his face at once. When she came up to him, he looked up, and there was bitterness and shame in him, and the same mute remorse that we never expected from him. All these years, Emily said, her voice low but audible to everyone, I thought my father had failed. Or that he just disappeared. I had no idea. I had no idea that he had been betrayed. I slowly descended from the pulpit, approached her, and held out my hand with a quiet but sincere gesture of sympathy. Miss Davis, I said, I'm so sorry for everything that's been taken away from you and your family. Her eyes, full of tears, seemed to reflect not only the depth of the shock, but also the power of the love that, despite all the isolation and silence, surrounded her life. She turned to me, and her gaze, trembling with a feeling, seemed to be looking for confirmation that her soul had not been deceived. Her voice, although it was almost a whisper, penetrated me to the very depths of my heart. Thank you for having the courage to share the truth, Megan. She sobbed slightly, pressing her fingers to her lips before continuing. She looked out for me all my life, didn't she? She was trying to fix everything. And in that quiet, barely perceptible phrase, there was no accusing pain, but gratitude, mixed with surprise, with the tender realization that all her victories, all her luck, even the smallest blessings in life, were part of a plan, caring, invisible, but persistent. I answered her as quietly as she wanted, with restraint and respect for a moment that turned out to be almost sacred in its silence. The hours after the funeral flew by almost imperceptibly, although at every moment there was a sense of intense expectation, as if the air between us was filled with sparks of the untold. The reception was organized with all the outward rigor typical of the Huntington family, but under this outer shell emotions, hidden resentments, unspoken accusations were bubbling. As expected, it turned out to be full of disagreements. The relatives split into small groups, as if trying to hide from the truth, hiding behind their beliefs. Some, foaming at the mouth, insisted that everything exposed be forgotten as a terrible dream, buried forever with Meghan. Others, on the contrary, demanded the immediate intervention of the authorities, wanting to restore justice with maximum rigor. And someone was just sitting in mute shock, staring at one point, as if their world had suddenly lost its shape, and they were just beginning to realize how deeply the roots of lies had penetrated into their lives. My father, unable to withstand the onslaught of emotions and other people's stares, quickly disappeared without even saying goodbye, and weeks passed before anyone heard from him again. It was said that he had gone to the coast, others that he had left the country altogether, but the truth, oddly enough, turned out to be simpler and more humane. He ended up in a rehabilitation center, where he finally began to struggle with the heavy burden of guilt that he, perhaps without even realizing, had carried for decades. This struggle was painful, but necessary. Later repentance may not completely purify, but it gives a chance for redemption, and this chance, albeit belated, became salvation for him. Meanwhile, the story of Huntington Industries unfolded before the eyes of the whole country. The revelations contained in Meghan's letter became public, causing not only a wave of interest, but also heated discussions on television, in newspapers, at shareholder meetings. And yet, despite all the resonance, it turned out that, as always, she was right. The company held out. Thanks to Emily's technical skill and my commitment to the ethical ideals bequeathed to Meghan, Huntington Industries has begun a new chapter in its history, not on the ruins of the past, but on a renewed foundation where the truth has become a compass instead of a burden. A year later, I found myself in Meghan's rose garden, her favorite place where she found solace when the world seemed too cruel. Now this garden, well-groomed and blooming, was more beautiful than ever. The Queen Elizabeth roses, gently pink and majestic, seemed to hover over the scarlet petals of other varieties, and the air was filled with a subtle, noble scent of memory and peace. Emily started coming to see me here every week, and our meetings became more than business discussions. They were meetings of two souls sincerely dedicated to a cause that grew out of pain, but blossomed out of the truth. We planned strategies, exchanged ideas, dreamed and argued, and in each such conversation there was more life than in all board meetings combined. Do you know what's weird? Emily said one day, carefully running her fingers over the velvet petals of the very rose that Meghan especially loved. I always felt like I was being guided, that someone was protecting me, as if someone's invisible hand was controlling my life. She paused for a moment, peering at the flower as if looking for an answer in it, and then added, I thought it was my father's spirit watching over me from the outside. And now I realized that it was Meghan all along. I felt a lump rise in my throat. I looked at her, at that face in which my father's stubbornness was combined with my mother's tenderness, and whispered, she tried to protect everyone, the staff, the legacy, even my father. But she couldn't let the truth remain hidden forever. Emily nodded, as if considering every syllable. Do you think, she asked softly, that she made the right decision after waiting all these years? I didn't answer right away. I looked at the garden, at the sun's rays sliding over the petals, and thought about the nights when Meghan woke up, anxiously looking into the darkness, and about those morning walks when she peered at the horizon, as if looking for forgiveness there. I think, I finally said, that she did her best in that desperate situation. She turned a business built on deception into something truly kind and useful. She made sure that you flourished and made sure that the truth came out in her own way on her terms. Emily was silent for a moment. Her gaze became more attentive, studying. And you? She asked, have you ever regretted having to tell such a difficult truth? I looked at the garden again, and an image of her surfaced before my eyes, with her mysterious half-smile, with light in her eyes, with a quiet, almost monastic determination to keep the truth until she was ready to reveal herself. No, I said with a confidence that needed no confirmation. Meghan chose me because she knew I could handle it. She trusted me to understand that facing the difficult truth is sometimes the only way to truly be honest. Emily smiled warmly, looking into the distance at the Huntington Industries building, towering among the greenery. She would be proud of what we built, she said, and there was something in her voice that I hadn't heard before: peace. A real partnership. Exactly the way he and my father originally conceived it. I gently touched one of Megan's roses, which bloomed with such grace, as if she knew that now she was blooming not just in the garden, but in the space of memory, hope, and renewal. And at that moment I felt the breath of those women who took care of these bushes before us living in her, passing on their past from generation to generation, like a relic, as a sign of feminine wisdom, love, and patience. Megan once told me that these roses hold the same secrets as our hearts. There's a story in every petal, a lesson in every thorn, and a chance for redemption in every new bud. But maybe now that the truth has found its voice, it's time to create new traditions, not those based on concealment and silence, but on honesty and openness, on partnership in which every voice counts, and on cooperation where strength is shown not in dominance, but in support. Emily, feeling my fingers tremble, gently squeezed my hand, and on her face I saw the very hope that once lived in Megan's eyes, pure, without a shadow of doubt. I think both our fathers would appreciate it, she said with such sincerity in her voice that I felt like a strong, unbreakable bond had been established between us, rooted in the past but facing the future. Later that evening, when I was alone in Megan's office, in the room that was now mine but still filled with her spirit, I looked through the company's reports, letting my thoughts wander far beyond the numbers and diagrams. New ideas, strategies, and directions were born in my head, in which Huntington Industries could develop to become not only sustainable, but also inspiring. And suddenly, among the usual papers, when I was flipping through an old desktop calendar, my gaze fell on a neatly folded piece of paper that slipped right onto the table. Its date coincided with the day Megan died, and her familiar, elegant handwriting, smooth and confident, as if written not by the hand of a tired woman, but by a soul full of peace, caused a lump in my throat. Dear Elizabeth, the note began, and my fingers trembled from these words. If you are reading this, you have fulfilled my last request. You bravely faced the truth and dealt with it with amazing grace. That's why I chose you. Not just to inherit Huntington Industries, but to turn it into the company that Kevin and I once represented. I couldn't stop writing. Every word seemed to embrace me, give me strength, make me breathe deeper. Next spring, the roses in the garden will bloom again. When you see their petals open, remember that. Even on the darkest soil, beauty can blossom. If only we dare to plant the seeds. With all my love, Megan. I carefully put the precious note back in my desk drawer, closing it as carefully as if it contained Megan's own heart, and at that moment I felt something new begin to sound in me, not just inspiration, but deep, complete awareness. Outside the window, as if responding to my thoughts, the setting sun gently enveloped the rose garden with warmth, amber and gold, enveloping it like a blanket on a cool evening. It was not just a beautiful end to the day, it was a living reminder of how important it is to remember, honor, and continue. Megan left me much more than a successful business empire, much more than trust and responsibilities. She gave me a chance. A chance to correct old mistakes, a chance to build something truly meaningful, a chance to prove that the truth, even if it has lived in the shadows for a long time, will one day find its way to the light and blossom. I knew that tomorrow would bring with it a lot of things to do, endless meetings, difficult decisions, and the relentless responsibility that accompanies every step a leader takes, especially in a company that stands at the crossroads of the past and the future. But that evening, in the privacy of Megan's office, where the walls seemed to hold her thoughts, her dreams, her strength, surrounded by the subtle scent of roses, I realized for the first time the essence of the true legacy. It is not measured in capital or market share. It lives in the truths that we choose to carry on, in the lessons that we embody in actions, and in the courage to turn pain, the one that once broke us, into a force that now supports others. Like Megan, I decided to keep this truth, not for the sake of destruction, but for the sake of creation, not for the sake of accusation, but for the sake of healing. And that's exactly what I saw as my mission, not just to continue her work, but to create something lasting and beautiful out of the complexities of our history. That's what she did. It was the path that she had been leading me to invisibly throughout my life. And now, when I felt her presence not as a shadow of the past, but as the light of the present, I knew that she was watching me, somewhere beyond the visible, with that very special, understanding smile, which always had more than words could express. A smile full of pride and peace, because her latest secret had finally found a voice, and was welcomed into the warm, healing glow of daylight.